Hello, everyone. This is Chris from the Pain and Glory blog, coming to you with my second video in the So You Want to Play series of Blood and Valor, the World War I skirmish game by Firelock Games. In this edition, we have So You Want to Play the British. Now, one thing before we start actually talking about the British, I'm going to change the video format up a little bit from my French video. In the French video, I went into some of the math behind what made certain units more or less cost effective. I'm actually going back and I'm revising that math, but also I really wanted to make these So You Want to Play videos very focused on just the reasons why you would want to play a particular nation. And on top of that, what are the variety of units that you could take? What are some of their strengths and weaknesses? A little bit on just their points. So you can say, oh, this one's very strong, but it's also very expensive versus this less expensive one. But I'm going to do a totally separate video series on points, efficiency, the roles of various units from a tactical point of view, and a little more of the kind of tournament level, uh, what they would call math hammer um, of the game. So today, So You Want to Play the British, and those eagle eye among you have probably noticed already. There's a bunch of different flags on there. What gives? Of course, up in the top right, we do have the Union Jack, the flag of Britain, but down in the bottom right, what is that flag? Well, it's a historic flag. It doesn't really exist anymore. The bottom right flag is the flag that represented British India. Of course, India did not break away from Britain and become independent until after World War II. We're talking about 30 plus years before that. In the bottom left, that's Canada. Canada was not an independent country until after World War I. So Canada is still part of the Commonwealth. When Britain joins World War I, Canada is brought in along with it. And in the top left, that is the flag representing British South Africa. So does this represent all of the nations of the Commonwealth that Britain brought into the war? Not even close. And in fact, that is one of the big reasons why I think Britain is a really great choice to play in Blood and Valor, especially if you're someone who loves the hobbying side of games. So why should you play the British? Well, your country needs you, says Lord Kitchener. And well, if you're not British and you're not listening to Lord Kitchener, here's a couple of other reasons. First of all, 1917. The movie came out about a year ago. It is October 2020 at this time. One of, I think, the best war movies of recent memory, if not all time, showing the perspective of the British enlisted men in the Western Front during the late war. And if that did not get you in the mood to play some World War I miniatures games, really nothing is going to. So that inspired you to play the British. That's great. But one thing that movie did just a little bit, just in one particular scene, you'll remember the scene in the truck, is it showed you that if you're playing the British, you don't just have to be English. There are so many different options when you are playing a quote unquote British list that the choices are almost endless. Of course, you can be the English with their Brodie helmets, you can be the Scottish with their kilts. Did they really wear kilts all the time? Who cares? It's a miniatures game. Have fun with them. Model them with kilts and ridiculous plaids if you want to. But in addition to those two troops from the actual British Isles, you have troops from the Caribbean. You had Indian troops, and Indian troops have their own varieties like Sikh and Muslim and Hindus. You had African troops. You had South African troops. You had Canadian troops, like I mentioned before. That is not everything. That is really everything I put on my list of notes here. So you have so many choices when you are thinking about, okay, yeah, my list might be the same between them, but my English army and my Indian army and my African army are all going to look very different from each other. And that gives you a lot of choices when it comes to building your army and modeling and doing conversion work in this game. And that's personally one of my favorite things. I actually made up a British Indian Sikh force to use in the Near East campaigns. So you've really got choices there. Now, I did leave off Australia and New Zealand. And fans of Australia and New Zealand, I would like you to know I did not forget them. The only reason I left them off is because they actually have their own separate Anzac list, which I will be covering in a future video. So please, if you're already writing a comment about how I forgot about the Australians and the New Zealanders, I promise I didn't. I will get to them. Now, just like the sun never sets on the British Empire fought in every corner of the globe. Obviously, the Western Front, but also British East Africa, their colonies in the Middle East. You may have heard of a guy named Lawrence of Arabia. The Mediterranean, such as Gallipoli and the Dardanelles. The British sent troops to support the Entente in the Balkans, to support Italy at the end of the war. There were even British troops fighting the Germans in China in the beginning of the war. You got a little bit of Asian action going on there, which there wasn't really a ton of in World War I. It was really a quiet part of World War I, unlike in World War II, where there was a lot of stuff going on in China. Now, what do the British rules-wise have going for them? The French had their French elan. They were tough. They're hard to pin down. They can shrug off fatigue. The British, they have for king and country. All British Corps and command units gain the Assault Expert special rule. What does that do? Assault Expert lets you re-roll a failed result during the shoot save test of defensive fire. Let's translate that. You're charging into the enemy. Unless you have that enemy pinned down sufficiently where they can't fire back at you, that means they get this defensive fire roll. Now, normally, if they get a little bit lucky, they might kill some of your units and even push you back so that your charge fails. The British get another shot at those failed rolls, meaning that the British overall are a bit more of a close combat charging oriented army. They are just that much extra oomph when it comes to charging into combat, even if they haven't quite pinned down their enemy in a way that might make it 100% safe. But there are a lot of um, units in the British lists that are not considered officially British. Sort of like how in the French list you had the Senegalese and the Harlem Hellfighters who did not get the French tough roles. The British have a lot of quote unquote not British troops who don't get this role, the assault expert role. They instead get something else. So that gives the British a lot of different options, a lot of different variety. But overall, if you want to play a more close combat oriented list, the British are a good choice for you. Now, what are some of the variety of troops that you get when you're dealing with the main British list? So this is for the Western Front British. It's also kind of their generic list. You could theoretically, like for an example, there is not a British Asian forces list, so you might want to use the generic list, aka the Western Front list, although that was also early war, so there is a very special early war list that we're not going to go over because it's really just this list but restricted. So pick up the book, you'll see all of the different options. But in the Western Front, the British get their standard command options that pretty much every army gets: the lieutenant, the captain, the major. In terms of command characters, they get Lieutenant Edgar Towner. He was actually an Australian-born soldier who started in World War I as an enlisted man. He served at a couple of major battles like Gallipoli and the Somme. He eventually was promoted to an officer status as a lieutenant, and he was really famous for charging single-handedly into a German machine gun position, capturing it, turning the gun around to fire on the Germans, and then continuing to fight for 30 hours straight. For that, he earned the Victoria's Cross, and he lived into the 1970s. He died at 82. They also get this guy named Lieutenant J.R.R. Tolkien. There's not actually a lot out there that I could really find. I did find in his Wikipedia article he wrote some books after the war, but other than that, it definitely wasn't as much out there about him during the war as the far more famous Edgar Towner. In terms of troops, you get your core riflemen, you have your inexperienced riflemen. The core riflemen, the regular ones, can take grenades and rifle grenades and light machine guns, kind of like every other rifleman in the game. One of the main ideas of Blood and Valor is that a rifleman is a rifleman between pretty much every army. There is a special character version of the rifleman that we'll get into, Sergeant Major Williams. The British get a sniper team. They also have a special sniper I'll talk about in a little bit. Of course, they get their heavy machine gun. They get their close combat specialists, the trench raiders, the Scottish close combat specialists, the Gurkhas, the favorite of many bolt action players. They also in the early war get cavalry, and in terms of off-table support, you can bring in artillery barrage and also a gas barrage, which I'm not going to talk that much about in this video, but I will cover them in a separate video about the variety of off-table support weapons. So let's look at some of the core units, the riflemen. Or rather, let's look at the command choices. We have our lieutenant. He's 0 points. We have our captain, he's 15 points. We have our major, he's 25 points. And you can see that as you go up in rank, your command range gets a little bit bigger. That's the range at which you can order your troops to do special actions. And also you give them a resolve bonus. You lower their resolve score because remember, lower is better in this game because you want to roll above that number. You want to roll that number or higher. So they get more expensive. If you're playing in a bigger table, that broader 12-inch command score can be very useful. You can also see the captain and the major have more command points to order their troops, and the major gets a bit of a boost on initiative rolls when you have tied bids. Edgar Towner, the man who single-handedly charged at the German machine gun, he's 30 points. He's a little more than a major. You can see that his stats are a little the same as a major, so that extra 5 points gives Lieutenant Edgar one unit that is nearby him at the beginning of the game can advance setup. It means they get a free run action before the game starts. So he just gets he can give one of his units a bit of a head start at charging towards the enemy, much like he charged directly towards the Germans. Um, Lieutenant Tolkien, on the other hand, he is also 30 points. He doesn't actually have any special rules. Really, the only difference between Lieutenant Tolkien and the Major is he's 5 points more expensive, and he gets a +2 to tied initiative rolls. I personally don't think that Lieutenant Tolkien is really particularly worth it, but of course that is up to you to decide. Now, moving on, like I said, to the core choices. In the core choices, we have 3 different varieties of riflemen. We have the standard British riflemen who can be armed with grenades, they can be armed with rifle grenades, they can be armed with light machine guns. On top of that, they also have the inexperienced riflemen, which are pretty much the same as the regular riflemen. Some of their stats are a little bit worse, but their shooting is just as good. They cost 3 points per model instead of 4 points per model, and they can't take the special weapons that the regular riflemen can take. They can't take rifle grenades. They can't take light machine guns. They can take grenades. So if you manage to get your inexperienced riflemen up close, those grenades are pretty useful. They don't care if you're experienced or regular riflemen. A grenade blows up just as good. Now, there is a variety of your British riflemen. It is Company Sergeant Major Williams's riflemen. He is actually still 4 points per model for his squad. The whole squad just gets like a bonus 4-point extra cost. So the models themselves aren't more expensive, but say your 4-man squad, instead of being 16 points, is 20 points. So, and if you went up to a 5-man squad, it would be 24 points, and so on and so forth. They gain tough. That's the same as the French rule. When they rally, they drop 1 resolve for free. They also gain blood-curdling charge, which is when you charge, you get a -1 bonus to your close combat score. So that makes them really good budget close combat teams, because they're going to be cheaper overall and per figure than a actual dedicated close combat team. And as a bonus, you will get the core troop initiative of 3 points instead of the support troop initiative of 1 point. So it's going to give you more initiative points for bidding. That makes them, I think, a really good choice for not that many extra points over the British Riflemen. Of course, you're limited to 1 because there's only 1 Company Sergeant Major Williams, but I think he's a good choice. In terms of support troops, we've got some pretty standard ones. The British sniper team. Now, the British actually are the only sniper team in the game that comes with a 2-man team. They used a sniper spotter arrangement that would become far more common in later years. It does make them a little bit more expensive than the other nations' snipers. They're 12 points instead of, say, the German and the French 8 points. But of course, it does mean they can take an extra hit without just completely disappearing. So I think that extra point is actually worth it. The British also come with a heavy machine gun team. They can take cavalry, which the early war. But what I think is really special about the British, and another really excellent character, is, and I apologize in advance for any mispronunciation, Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow. Now, he was actually a Canadian First Nation soldier. He was an Indigenous Canadian. He fought in World War I, and was actually considered the deadliest sniper of any army in World War I, with 378 confirmed kills, as well as capturing over 300 enemy soldiers over the course of the war. He fought pretty much through the entire war, including surviving the very first chlorine gas of the war during the Second Battle of Ypres, which caused irreparable damage to his lungs through his entire life. He fights until the end of the war, regardless of the damage to his lungs because of the chlorine attack. He's discharged in 1919 after the war is over. At that time, he is the most decorated First Nation soldier in all of Canadian history. Unfortunately, his story When he returns to Canada at the time, rights for First Nations Canadians were not particularly strong, and he went on to be a leader in the First Nations civil rights movement. And in fact, in 1945, he was elected the Supreme Chief of the Native Independent Government, a early Indigenous rights organization in Canada. So he had quite a life story during and after World War One. Mechanically, he's 15 points instead of the British sniper team's 12, although he is alone there instead of coming with a buddy. He is a little more fragile because of that. But he can reroll all failed shoot rolls. And then once per game, he can reroll a shoot save. So even though he is one less person to kind of act as a meat shield for him, he's a little hardier because he can reroll that shoot save that he may have failed and thus died. He's also far more effective as a sniper because he can re-roll those shoot tests every single time. I think he's really worth it if you have those extra 3 points over the 12-point team. Not only does he have a fantastic story and an interesting life, but I think on the table he can be very useful. Finally, moving on to the last part of the British Western Front Army, we have the close combat specialists. Now you have your generic trench raiders. They're 6 points per model. In addition to the British assault experts, they also pick up close combat specialists, which lets them re-roll all close combat rolls, and also barbed wire tests to get through that barbed wire. If you don't want to go with the trench raiders, which are generic, they could kind of be of any nation, you have the Scottish close combat specialists. I love these guys mechanically, and also kilts are fun, but they drop assault experts, so they're a little squishier because if you charge into an enemy that can defensive fire at you, you're going to take a little more damage. But if you have the enemy properly pinned down, not only do they have close combat specialists, they also have blood-curdling charge. That's a -1 bonus to their close combat on the turn where they charge, plus their re-rolling fails, and they're the same points cost as the trench raiders. I think that makes the Scottish close combat specialist something really deadly. If you said, man, I love the blood curling charge, but I would also love assault experts, well, how about you take a look at the Gurkhas, every bolt action player's favorite, most overpowered infantry unit. In a bolt action, they are murderously dangerous in close combat. In Blood and Valor, I think they're actually appropriately pointed. They are more expensive than the regular trench raiders and the Scottish close combat specialists, but they get close combat specialist, assault expert, and blood curdling charge. I personally don't think I would take them because you have the trench raiders if you want something a little more defensive, and the Scottish if you want something a little more aggressive, but they're there for you if you have some extra points. Now, you don't think we're actually done yet. This is not the end of the British. I told you in the beginning that the British fought in every corner of the world. And while Firelock Games did not include army lists for literally every part of the world that the British fought in, they include not one, not two, but 3 separate British army lists covering 3 major areas where the British fought. So moving on from the kind of generic British list that is primarily the Western Front, but you could really use it anywhere. We're going to move on to, I think, the second most famous area where the British fought, which actually was less about the British and more about the Arab revolt. We're talking about the Near East, led by the famous T.S. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, Renaissance man. He helped incite the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. He was involved in multiple battles, and he has a movie named after him. What more can you want? The movie is really great if you have 5 hours to watch it. Of course, you can take your standard commander options. You can take any single unit from the Western Front list, excluding the named characters, the special named characters we went over. In addition to that, you've got 4 brand new Near East only units, the Arab Irregular Riflemen, the Australian Light Horse, the Arab Irregular Cavalry, and the Arab Irregular Assault Team. This is maybe one of the only lists I actually like the cavalry. So let's go and take a look at that. Command choices, Lawrence of Arabia is expensive. He is 40 points. But oh, does he give you so much to work with. In addition to his 12-inch command range, he has not 2, but 3 command points. He can issue units 3 orders, well, 1 order per unit within those 12 inches. He can move waves of men forward. That's not even counting every officer's blow the whistle action, which lets everyone within 12 inches move. +2 those tied initiative rolls. Instead of a -1 to resolve checks for all every unit within 12 inches. It's a -2 to resolve checks, so good luck shaking anything around him. He can also be mounted on cavalry for no extra points, letting him get a free advance move every single turn, although it does make him a little easier to shoot. The only downside to Lawrence of Arabia, besides his incredibly high cost, is he can only be used in a list containing Arab irregulars as a core unit. Now, that doesn't mean you can't take British infantry, it just means you have to take Arab irregulars, which are useful in some areas, but maybe not so useful in other areas. So let's take a look at the Arab irregulars. The Arab irregulars are the same points cost as the regular British riflemen. It's 4 points. They have a worse shoot score, but a better close combat score, but close combat save score, which I think gives you a hint as to what their use is. They get Assault Expert, and they pick up Blood Curdling Charge. They're one of the only core infantry squads that gets Blood Curdling Charge. Not the only, but one of the only, making them an incredible budget close combat option. I would not use Arab irregulars to lay down suppressing fire. They're not particularly good at that. Use something else to lay down suppressing fire and get these Arab riflemen into the thick of things. That's where they're going to do their damage. You still have access to British riflemen. You still have access to inexperienced riflemen if you want to spend less points. But hey, look, you're fighting in the Near East. You want Lawrence of Arabia. You're going to take these Arab riflemen. Otherwise, go back to the Western Front. In terms of cavalry, you get two really interesting cavalry units, very different. You have the Australian light horse pictured in the top right. They're a little expensive. They're 7 points, same as the Gurkhas. They get the cavalry rule, which gives them a free advance every turn. So it's a free 4 inches they can move, although cavalry are slightly restricted in what they can go over. They gain Blood Curdling Charge, and they have Furious Assault. We're going to talk more about Furious Assault when I cover the Anzacs, but quick preview, Furious Assault, instead of charging from 4 inches away, you can charge from 6 inches away. So that has two really valuable things. Number one, grenades are very dangerous in defensive fire because normally you have to charge from within 4 inches. Grenades have a range of 4 inches, and grenades are extremely deadly. So if you're being defensive fired upon by a unit with grenades, that's bad. But if you're charging someone from, say, 5 or 6 inches away, and they're defensive firing you, they can't use their grenades on you. So that's particularly useful from a tactical point of view. Also, remember they're cavalry. That gives them a free advance 4 inches every turn. And they have 2 more actions. That means they can move another 4 inches. And then they can charge from 6 inches away. That's a total of 14 inches of movement. You can charge someone from almost halfway across the battlefield in a single turn. Really useful there. They are a little expensive, but I think they can be worth it because of their mobility and because of their charging. If you want something a little less expensive, you have the Arab Irregular Cavalry pictured there, mounted on horses, but they were also mounted on camels. So you've got some really great modeling options there. They're 6 points. They're cavalry. They have Blood Curdling Charge, but they lose that Furious Assault. They're also not, they have a worse shoot score. But again, they're a good budget option for your cavalry. In fact, the Middle East list for the Brits can take a combined total of 5 cavalry between these two units. I'm pretty sure that's more cavalry than any other list in the entire book. So if you really wanted to fight World War I like it was the Napoleonic era, then the British Near East list is for you. They can also take the sniper team, and they can also take the heavy machine gun. So hey, use that heavy machine gun to lay down the suppressing fire, and then let your Australian and Arab cavalry charge in to mop them up. Finally, and a little more disappointingly, in terms of close combat, I believe you can still take the trench raiders, the Scots, and the Gurkhas, because the way the list is constructed, it says you can take anything from the Western Front list, and then it just generically says in the specifics that you can take close combat specialists, and all 3 of those are classified as close combat. The Arab close combat specialists, called the Irregular Assault Team, I'm not a huge fan of them because they are 6 points per model. That's the same as the Arab cavalry unit, and it's only 1 point less than the Australian cavalry unit. They get Blood Curdling Charge. They get close combat specialists, so the cavalry aren't re-rolling their failed attacks, but they have the movement advantage. The Arab irregulars get advanced setup. They can move 8 inches after setup, but before the beginning of the game. Here's where I'm not a big fan of them. They are only armed with pistols and grenades. So until you get within 6 inches where you can shoot with pistols, or within 4 inches where you can shoot with the pistols and grenades, and then also charge, the Irregular Assault Team is just not going to be able to do anything for you. And I've seen so many games where getting into close combat is something that only happens at in maybe the last 3, maybe even the last 2 turns of the game, depending on how effective the enemy is at pinning you down. So the Irregular Assault Team, yeah, it's very good at charging. I will totally admit that. And the advanced setup will get them closer to the enemy on that first turn. But if you're not getting them into close combat, you are not getting their points worth, and they are a little expensive. I'm not saying never take them, but in this case, this is going to be maybe the only time I'll ever say this. I think you should actually take the cavalry over the close combat specialists. The final army list that the British have in this book is the British East African colonies, where there was a continuous fight between a very small German force and the British, some European British, but primarily African British subjects. This didn't last the entire war. It lasted from kind of the early to the mid-war a little bit, and it gives you less options than the Middle East. This is the one list where I think it's a little lacking. Not that it's bad, it's just you don't have as many options here. In terms of command, you get your regulars. You also have Captain Richard Meinertzhagen. Apologies to Captain Meinertzhagen. He was an intelligence officer, also really into birds. He served in the East Africa, also then moved on to the Middle East. And one of the things about Captain Meinertzhagen is he's been accused of certain exaggerations, and the sourcing that he offered on his escapades is perhaps a little less than reputable. So did he do a lot of interesting things? I'm sure he did. Did he do all of the interesting things that he says he did? Probably not. But an interesting man to research in that, so you can kind of separate the fact from, well, honestly, his fiction a little bit. Unlike the Middle East, British East Africa can only take units from the British East African list, which is a little more limited. You have your riflemen, you have King's African riflemen, we'll get into, you have cavalry, you have sniper teams, heavy machine gun, you have Colonial close combat specialist teams, just the one, and you can take artillery barrages, but you cannot take gas barrages like the Western Front. So Captain Meinertzhagen, what does he bring to the table? I'm actually not a huge fan of his rules from a rules perspective. He's 35 points, so he's 10 points over the major, and the only thing he gives you over the major is he lets 2 units get hidden setup. Hidden setup, you cannot be shot or targeted in any way, including by barrages, until you move or are shot at. You can't be charged, but that will take a couple turns for someone to get up to you. But again, that goes away once you shoot or move. You're usually going to want to start shooting or moving on your first or maybe your second turn. So this is a special rule, unlike the other special rules that are granted by these characters that last the entire game, like, oh, we just grant you Furious Assault the entire game. This one only lasts for a turn or two, effectively. Maybe it's better in a defensive game. I don't think that's worth 10 points over a regular major. In terms of the core troops, you get what are classified as British, European, or Colonial Riflemen. So modeling, you can make them, again, European or African Riflemen. Actually, there were a lot of Indian troops in the East African campaign as well. So really, you can go with a lot of different choices. They are pretty much identical to the regular British Riflemen, except you can't take rifle grenades. I don't think that's a huge loss. I actually don't really like rifle grenades mechanically. I don't think they're very points effective. Your alternative here is the King's African Riflemen. They are also 4 points per model, although they are classified as the inexperienced troops because they offer you only 2 initiative points instead of the regular riflemen's 3. What makes them valuable is for 4 points a model, they lose the regular British assault experts, but they pick up blood curdling charge, and I've sung the praises of that, giving you the bonus to the charge. They also have 5 resolve, which is normally something reserved for close combat specialists, whereas regular troops will only have 6 resolve. This is going to make them incredibly hard to scare away off the field. And so they are, again, a really good budget assault troop, much like the Arab Irregular Corps troops. In terms of support units, they get the sniper, they get the heavy machine gun, and they get the close combat specialists, just like the trench raiders, 6 points per model, and they get close combat specialists and assault experts. And then there's also artillery barrage. So the East Africans don't really have that many options. They have them, and I think the King's African Rifleman is an interesting choice if you're looking for an inexpensive assault-oriented army. There's just not that much after that, and I think you could do that mechanically a lot better with a Arab army in the Middle East. Of course, if you really want to go with the flavor, you've got this option. So this is why you should play the British. The British just have so many choices in terms of where you're fighting and who exactly your army is representing. In terms of, you have so much variety that it really makes it a great option for people looking for all these conversions. The third video, which will be coming sometime next week, we're going to be focusing on the first and really the most major of all of the central powers, and that is, of course, going to be Germany. And then we're going to follow that up with 1 or 2 videos on some of the minor powers that are offered in the book, including the Americans, which maybe not a minor power, but they came to the war very late. We have the Anzacs that I mentioned today. We have the Ottomans, because someone's got to fight the British in the Middle East. And then finally, we have the Belgians, because of course you don't want to forget about the Belgians. So until my next video on the Germans, everyone, you have fun hobbying and stay safe out there. Goodbye.